This video is going to cover example 1 from the 2.7 notes about inverse functions. So initially we need to talk about what an inverse is. So you've already learned about inverses for arithmetic operations. So for example, the additive inverse, or if for addition it's called the opposite of 3, is -3. So subtraction is defined as adding the opposite. Therefore, subtraction is the inverse operation of addition because it undoes addition. The multiplicative inverse, or reciprocal of 3, is 1/3. Division is defined as multiplying by the reciprocal, or the multiplicative inverse. Division is the inverse operation of multiplication because it undoes multiplication. So if we extend this idea out to a function, an inverse function is going to undo, or an inverse function undoes the original function. So our goal in this section is talk about what is an inverse function, how do we verify that we have inverse functions, and how do we then find the equations for inverse functions. So what's the notation for inverse functions? An inverse function is denoted, the inverse function of f of x is denoted like this: f to the -1 of x. Now note, this -1 to denote the inverse function does not mean the reciprocal. It's not like exponents where we have 3 to the -1 would be 1/3. F to the -1 x is not equal to 1 over f of x. It means the inverse. Let's find some inverses informally, just thinking about the idea of undoing a function. So for example 1a, if our original function is 5 times x, our original function multiplied x by 5. So the inverse function must divide by 5, must undo the original function. So it must divide by 5. So our inverse function, f inverse of x, is going to be x divided by 5. Similarly, if I have g of x is equal to x minus 8, the original function subtracts 8. So the inverse function must do the inverse. So it must add 8. It must undo what g of x does. So g inverse of x, that's how we would say that, g inverse of x has to add 8. And we're doing these intuitive or informal ways of finding inverse functions just so you understand it. Later, we're going to learn the formal way to find an inverse function.